I'm a positive person. I'm an optimist. We already talked about this crushing Cardinals loss. I'm trying to keep things upbeat. It's hard to do that when you're discussing the Missouri Tigers football team right now, especially after that crushing defeat at home to Tennessee, 62-24. You said you were there. You're going to be shooting the game where Josh Heupel's offense just does a play about every 7 seconds, and that was surely the case. And most of those plays worked very well for the Volunteers.
Yeah, and, at least with the Cardinals, they played really well to get where they did, and, definitely a crushing defeat. But, the Cardinals, I think there's still a lot of positives to take, whereas with Mizzou football, there's really no positives. When you're giving up more than 450 yards on the ground, it's unimaginable, especially against a Tennessee team that really is not that good. They were pummeled by Florida the week before. We just saw Florida lose to Kentucky. The SEC's weird, and, everything's a little weird week to week. But there's no excuse for what happened on Saturday. Mizzou played like an FCS team. It felt like Tennessee was Alabama, and that's just not the case. Mizzou's now giving up 307 yards per game on the ground this season. They've given up more than 1,500 yards rushing on the year. That's more than 200 yards more than the second worst team among all Division I teams, which is Arkansas State. That just says it all right there. It is really, really bad for the Mizzou football team. Coach Drinkwitz went ahead and fired defensive line coach Jethro Franklin as a way to hopefully make some sort of change on the defense, but he kept Steve Wilkes, the defensive coordinator. So now they go into homecoming week against North Texas. They're 20-point favorites, but as I'm sure you know, Charlie, 0-5 against the spread is Eli Drinkwitz this year. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it did seem like that the performances, especially defensively, were so bad that somebody unfortunately had to lose their job, and Steve Wilkes was talked about, and clearly that move was not made. But Eli Drinkwitz does go, and as you mentioned, they fired D-line coach Jethro Franklin. So when you're seeing what's going on the defensive line, defensive side of the ball, just allowing that many rushing yards every single week, and it's probably a combination personnel versus technique. If you fire a D-line coach, I'm guessing that's thinking, hey, you can teach these guys a little better to go out there and execute. But what do you think? Is it more personnel? Is it more scheme and technique? What do you think?
I still think it's a little bit of everything. You look at Steve Wilkes, and I even asked Coach Drinkwitz this question. Steve Wilkes, he's a proven NFL head. He's been an NFL coach. It didn't go so well, but he was a defensive coordinator for a long time in the NFL. Clearly, he knows what he's doing. I don't think anyone would sit here and say that Steve Wilkes doesn't know football and doesn't know how to coach a team. He's done it for forever. So where is the disconnect here? What is going wrong? That's the question I asked Drinkwitz, and he said, we're working to figure it out. So it was short and sweet, and hopefully they do figure it out. But, you look at the defensive line, and they've got some talent. Trajan Jeffcoat was a star last year for the Tigers. He was second-team preseason SEC this year, expected to have a big year. It was supposed to be we were talking about who was going to get drafted in next year's NFL draft. A lot of people thought that Trajan Jeffcoat was that next guy. Well, right now he's, where is he? We don't even know. Kobe Whiteside, another guy, he's coming off an injury, but this guy had multiple sacks, multiple two-sack games last year for Mizzou. So where is he at? Akil Byers, he was at SEC Media Days, and a lot of Mizzou fans and us covering the team saw that as, hey, maybe this guy's really stepped up in practice and he's going to be a star. Hasn't really shown up. So perhaps, Drinkwitz said that there was a disconnect at the line of scrimmage. That's his coach speak word, but whatever that means, there's a disconnect. And he was asked, what does that mean? And he gave us another coach speak answer. So it is what it is, but they got to figure it out. And perhaps, taking Jethro Franklin out of the equation, maybe that changes things. Coach Drinkwitz did say he had to it was his way of making a change. And I think, not firing Steve Wilkes might have been more about money. Steve Wilkes is the highest paid coordinator Mizzou's ever had, and he makes about $1 million a year. He's on a 2-year contract, so it would probably be difficult. There's not a surprise to say Mizzou's facing athletic deficit and financially, so it's would have been tough to fire him. Not to say that he still can't get fired later on in the season if this continues. I mean, Drinkwitz might be left with no choice but to go to his new athletic director, Desiree Francois, and say, hey, I made a mistake. But that also goes back on him. This is not a leftover from the Odom era. This is a guy that he went out and he recruited to coach the defense. So he's kind of stuck with Steve Wilks. And unlike Barry Odom, a lot of people say, why don't you fire Steve Wilks now? Well, because Barry Odom fired Damani Cross a couple of years ago, the defensive coordinator. Well, that's because Barry Odom probably figured, hey, I'm a defensive guy. I can figure this out. I could coach the defense for the rest of the year until we figure something else out. Well, Drinkwitz, he's an offensive guy. I don't know if he can turn to anybody else to take that role. So he really is kind of stuck with Steve Wilks, but that's not to say that this isn't a conversation we'll continue to have.
We're talking with Andrew Kauffman, sports director at KMIZ-TV in Columbia, brought to you by International Tap House, iTap. We'll tell you about that in a few minutes. Yeah, not to belabor the Steve Wilks point, but also he didn't speak this week, correct? And I was just thinking, after 5 games, if people are talking about your defensive coordinator potentially being fired, and I do think that's a legit conversation, even though right now he's still employed at Mizzou, you also, as you said, you need to have somebody else to turn to run your defense, and that's where, when I was looking at the schedule, okay, you got North Texas, you got it. I mean, if Mizzou doesn't win this game, it's going to get really bad. But after that, Texas A&M, and then you have your bye week. So I'm thinking, if I'm Steve Wilks, if I don't turn things around the next couple weeks, because if you were to make a big-time change like that, you could already make the case that Jeff Rowe Franklin firing a coach mid-season is a big change. But if Steve Wilks were to go, if they don't clean it up in the next 2 weeks, then you have that bye week before Vanderbilt, that would be the spot that I would make a change if you're doing that, because you have a couple weeks to work on things.
Yeah, and I've seen bad homecoming losses before at Mizzou. I'm just going to put it out there. We all remember Middle Tennessee a couple years ago. That not to say that's going to happen this week, but I think Mizzou is very well aware of, they're 20-point favorites against North Texas. But if you can't stop the run, anything can happen. And if they play like they played against Tennessee, they're not going to beat anyone. If they played like that against SEMO, and they kind of did in the second half with all those backups in there, we saw, the SEMO outscored them in that game. So it's definitely was interesting that Steve Wilks did not talk to the media this week. I don't know this as a fact or anything, but it doesn't seem like that would be something that was Steve Wilks' decision, considering he's been an NFL head coach. He's talked to the media for decades. When he's talked to us, he's been very open, honest, upfront, answers every question to the best of his ability, and really is a stand-up guy. So for Drinkwitz to perhaps tell Steve Wilks not to talk this week, it's not just that Steve Wilks didn't talk this week. Drinkwitz held his news conference, and he spoke the least he's spoken since we've talked to him at Mizzou. I think the press conference was about 12 minutes long, and that's not because there wasn't a lot of questions that were asked. It's just because every question that we asked, he gave us a 5, 6, maybe 7-word answer. And so it was definitely, his theme this week is let's not talk, let's, show what we got with action. There's no depth chart this week. He's saying everyone needs to earn their spot. And, the guys that we did talk to this week were offensive lineman Case Cook, team captain, who didn't tell us really anything, gave us just, blah answers for the two or 3 minutes that he spoke to us. And then we got to speak with the punter, Grant McInnes. There's nothing against Grant McInnes. Honestly, he's probably been the Tigers' best. Punter. He was the Tigers' best player against Tennessee, but he didn't really give us much to go with either. So it's a weird week. It's interesting when coaches change things up, from what they've done every week. We've talked to Steve Wilks every week, and this week, not so much. And we only got 2 players. We usually talk to players on Wednesday, not this week.
Yeah, that's where if you're getting the punter and the long snapper for the interviews midweek, things usually aren't going well for your program. And that's where I heard some of the comments last week, and remember we talked about this last Thursday where Eli Drinkwitz, I thought, made just a very passing comment about Boston College that was totally taken out of context. And I understand teams use that for motivation, whatever. It's not the reason they lost the game. But, okay, you probably don't want to be providing bulletin board material. And then you continue to lose, and that's where I think one of the reasons people really like Eli Drinkwitz is he is very charismatic, and he's fun. He's a younger guy. He's on social media doing everything with the flip miss when there's a recruit, and he's giving out the scholarships, and people love it on social media. He seems like he's fun, and he likes to have fun. But if you're losing, you can't do that because it's a really bad look when you're going out there laughing, you're losing 62-24. So is that one of those things, too, where the last couple of weeks, as you mentioned, you're kind of seeing this guy close ranks a little bit?
Yeah, and as he's kind of alluded to, the honeymoon is over with him, and I think that, he really challenged the fans in the off season. We need the fans to show up. We need the fans to show up. And I thought he had made a lot of momentum, but he even admitted this week that we took a step back. And I think he's kind of looking himself in the mirror. Probably also looked at, the attendance, which was about 45,000 for that Tennessee game, which I believe is the lowest attendance for an SEC home game at Mizzou since they joined the SEC. So I think he's kind of looking himself in the mirror here and saying, hey, what's going on? I need to fix this. And, he says the fight starts this week. That's his main message this week. And like I mentioned with the depth chart, changing things up, trying to get the most out of his guys. I was at practice on Tuesday. We only get to spend about the first 45 minutes of practice, and then all the scrimmage, all the good stuff is after we leave. But I did get a sense that, it seemed like the players had responded. The new defensive line coach, Al Davis, he's the former defensive analyst, had kind of stepped in. It looked like he had provided some energy for that group. So perhaps that'll carry over to Saturday. And I will say, if you're going to have what happened to Mizzou last week against Tennessee, it's great to have a homecoming matchup against North Texas, who's 1-3 on the season, who is a 20-point underdog. So perhaps, even if all of the mistakes aren't corrected, you could still pummel them on Saturday and at least for 1 week say, hey, we've kind of fixed this.
We're talking with Andrew Kauffman, sports director at KMIZ-TV in Columbia, brought to you by International Tap House, ITAP. My final question for you, and I hate to keep being negative here, but when you have some bad losses, a really rough one last week to Tennessee at home, 62-24, and the fact that a lot of Eli Drinkwitz's positive momentum was in the recruiting game, especially the 2022 class, where he has a lot of big-time recruits. We all know about Luther Burden. So my question is, because it is pretty bad right now, do you think they're getting to a point, the Missouri coaching staff, are they worried a little bit about keeping some of these recruits as you're having a rough season here halfway through?
I think you could, and Drinkwitz obviously is very good at recruiting, so I'm sure he could spin zone this, saying, hey, last year was a COVID year, kind of washed, throw it out the window. So this is pretty much, he could say that this is year one. We still have a lot of players that weren't here when I was here. If you just look at last year's recruiting class that's now freshmen, this is the highest recruiting class, or I believe tied for the highest recruiting class Mizzou's ever had. And then what they've already got going into next year, it looks like he's going to break that record for the 2022 class. So I think he's good enough to spin zone it in a way that says, hey, we still have this momentum. Yeah, we're slipping up this year, but chalk it up as this is year one for our program and we're building something. So I would say he's still able to recruit at a high level, but if this happens again next year, then I think that's when the tides will, go against Drinkwitz. I still think, you mentioned the honeymoon is over, but he's still technically, he could spin zone it to say this is still his first year. So I don't think Mizzou's losing to Tennessee is going to affect whether or not they get Luther Burden or not. That's going to be tough in and of itself, though.
No doubt. Andrew Kauffman, appreciate the time every Thursday, sir. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the North Texas game and homecoming, and we will talk with you next Thursday. Hopefully, it better be after a Mizzou victory.
We'll see. We'll see if they even cover the spread. That'll be the big thing. But thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, sir. Andrew Kauffman, sports director at KMIZ-TV in Columbia, brought to you by International Tap House. ITAP, yeah, they better. Well, first of all, they better win. Now, covering, that's a different story as I'm looking that up right now. Jimmy Hewer, I saw it at 19. It is still
a
19-point spread. Mizzou minus 19. The over-under is 69 points against the Mean Green of North Texas, one of the best nicknames in the game there. Yeah, Mizzou better take care of business this Saturday. That interview with Andrew Kauffman brought to you by International Tap House. They got the new location, ITAP Delmar. It's open. Corner of Skinker and Delmar in the CVS building. They have college football and Sunday ticket there as well. Any ITAP location will have the Mizzou game on. If they're not on, just ask your bartender. They'll change the channel for you. And they got 5 locations now. Soulard, Del Mar in Columbia. That's the one that Andrew Kauffman goes to. You got Kansas City, the Crossroads location, and also Louisville. And the new location, ITAP Del Mar, they have trivia every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So each and every Thursday, Andrew Kauffman, brought to you by International Tap House, ITAP. And Jimmy Hewer, a couple minutes here before the reset. What do we got coming up at 2 o'clock on the program?
Thursday, we always visit with Howard Balzer, get our NFL fix. We'll see what's going on out there with the Arizona Cardinals and all things NFL, and then we'll probably revisit some baseball notes.
Yeah, this is that time of year where, unfortunately, when the Cardinals season ends, even though I'm all about playoff baseball, you got the Blues, of course, starting up. But this is where we really get into football as well. It'd be nice if Mizzou was a little better. NFL action tonight, you got, the Seahawks and the Rams on Thursday Night Football. That's where I'm saying. We had, what's that?
We got an actually decent game tonight for a change.
I know.
Instead of,
some of these
Jacksonville. Ooh, okay, thanks. We don't need that.
Yeah, that's where you actually have a game where it's interesting on the field. You don't have to have some type of betting action to actually be interested in that ball game. I think the Rams take care of business tonight against the Seahawks. Seahawks coming off a win. Seahawks beat the 49ers last week. That should be a good game on Thursday Night Football. And you got the baseball playoffs. You got the American League starting today. You got Tony versus Dusty, White Sox versus Houston. You got Tampa Bay versus the Boston Red Sox. You got to love baseball playoffs, even though we're all disappointed the Cardinals no longer in this thing. But then Friday, the best baseball day of the year, in my opinion. You got about 12 hours of playoff games from about noon till midnight.